In a city built on power and old money, one forbidden kiss in a penthouse elevator would cost $1 billion empire, destroy 3 generations of legacy, and prove that some love stories are worth losing everything for. This is the story about the Manhattan billionaire's son who dared to love another man against all odds. Before I begin, hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell to make sure you don't miss any new releases. Our story unfolds in the heart of Manhattan, where glass towers scrape clouds and fortunes are made before breakfast. The Ashford name sits atop this kingdom of steel and ambition, old money, older secrets, and a legacy that demands perfection from those who carry it. Sebastian Ashford. 24 years old. Heir to Ashford Industries, an empire worth $12 billion. Educated at Yale. Trained in London. Groomed since birth to inherit a throne made of real estate, tech portfolios, and influence that moves markets. His face has graced Forbes 3 times. His future was written in contracts signed before he could walk. But beneath the tailored Tom Ford suits and the polished smile he wore to charity galas, Sebastian was suffocating. Every handshake choreographed. Every relationship transactional. Every feeling evaluated for its return on investment. At night, alone in his penthouse that cost more than most people earn in a lifetime, he'd stand at the floor-to-ceiling windows and wonder if this glass palace was a kingdom or a cage. His father, Richard Ashford, had made it clear, Sebastian would marry Victoria Chen, daughter of the Chen technology empire, within 6 months. 2 dynasties united. Markets would celebrate. Shareholders would profit. The merger was perfect on paper, in boardrooms, in every way that mattered to men who measured worth in zeros. Sebastian had never kissed Victoria. Had barely touched her hand. But he'd shaken on the deal, because that's what Ashfords did. They honored agreements. They built empires. They certainly didn't fall in love. Across this city of dreams and delusions, in a cramped studio apartment in Washington Heights, lived someone who'd never heard of Sebastian Ashford. Marco Reyes. 22 years old. No inheritance but his mother's work ethic and his grandmother's recipes. By day, he delivered meals for Quick Bite, one of those apps that let the wealthy summon food with a tap. By night, he studied at City College, chasing a degree in social work that wouldn't make him rich but might let him help people who reminded him of his own family. Marco had grown up in the same apartment his mother cleaned 4 jobs to keep. He knew every crack in the sidewalk, every neighbor's story, every bodega owner by name. He understood something Sebastian's world had forgotten, that wealth isn't counted in bank accounts but in how many people would notice if you disappeared. He was beautiful in a way Sebastian's circle would call unrefined, strong hands from carrying delivery bags up walk-up stairs, bronze skin from a Colombian father he'd never met, dark eyes that held both mischief and wisdom. His smile could light up the dreariest subway car. His laugh made strangers laugh with him. Their worlds should never have touched. In a city of 8 million people, the odds of their paths crossing were astronomical. But fate, or perhaps just the algorithm of a food delivery app, had other plans. It was a Tuesday. Sebastian had dismissed his chef for the evening, craving something his staff couldn't provide, anonymity. He ordered Thai food through Quick Bite, barely glancing at his phone as he approved the $38 charge that meant nothing to him and would have been Marco's grocery budget for a week. When the private elevator to the penthouse opened, Marco stepped out carrying pad thai and spring rolls, and Sebastian's entire world tilted on its axis. Their eyes met. Time did that thing poets write about and cynics dismiss, it stopped. Marco in his delivery uniform, backpack slung over one shoulder, slightly out of breath from the rush. Sebastian in fitted black slacks and a white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, barefoot in his own home for once. The city lights of Manhattan glittered behind him through the windows like a galaxy had fallen to Earth. Sebastian had been looked at his entire life, by investors, by socialites, by photographers. But Marco looked at him like he was just a guy who ordered Thai food. Just a person. And something in Sebastian's chest, something he'd locked away so long ago he'd forgotten it existed, cracked open. Marco handed over the food with a smile that seemed to carry sunshine. Sebastian's fingers brushed Marco's hand during the exchange, and the touch sent electricity through both of them that no amount of wealth or wisdom could explain or dismiss. They stood there, the delivery complete but neither moving. Marco should have left. Sebastian should have closed the door. But Sebastian heard himself say, "It's late. You shouldn't have to rush. Do you want some water?" Marco should have said no. He had 6 more deliveries. His shift ended at midnight. He had class at 8 a.m. But he heard himself say, "Yeah. Sure. Thanks." That Tuesday became Wednesday became Thursday. The food orders kept coming. Always when Sebastian knew Marco would be working. Sebastian learned to time it perfectly. Marco's shift started at 6. By 6:30, an order would ping. Always something different. Always Sebastian's address. Always Marco who took the delivery, though he had to fight the app's rotation system to make sure he was the one climbing into that elevator. They started talking. Just 5 minutes. Then 10. Then 20. Marco would stand in that penthouse that cost more than his entire neighborhood, and they'd talk about everything and nothing. Sebastian learned that Marco's mother worked night shifts at a hospital. That Marco sent money home to his grandmother in Bogotá every month. That Marco believed in people the way Sebastian had been taught to believe in profit margins. Marco learned that Sebastian hated classical music despite his mother dragging him to the Philharmonic since he was 5. That Sebastian had never been on a subway. That Sebastian could recite market trends but couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed at something genuinely funny. That loneliness looked the same in a penthouse as it did in a studio apartment, it was just better decorated. One night, Sebastian asked Marco to stay for dinner. Not as staff. As a guest. Marco hesitated. He had deliveries, responsibilities, a world that depended on him showing up. But Sebastian looked at him with eyes that held the same hunger Marco felt, and he stayed. They sat on the balcony under Manhattan stars you could barely see through the light pollution, eating takeout Marco had delivered, and talked until 3 a.m. About dreams and fears and everything Sebastian had never been allowed to want. Marco told him about a boy he'd loved in high school, how his mother had cried but eventually hugged him tight and said love was love. Sebastian's throat tightened as he admitted he'd never told his family the truth about who he was, what he wanted, who he dreamed about when he was alone. Marco reached across the space between them and took Sebastian's hand. "You know what I think? I think you've been living someone else's life. Maybe it's time to try living your own." In that moment, something shifted. Sebastian looked at their joined hands, his pale and manicured, Marco's bronze and calloused, and saw the future he'd been too afraid to imagine. The first kiss happened in the elevator. Marco was leaving, both of them trying to pretend this was still just about food deliveries and polite conversation. The doors closed. They were alone in that suspended space between floors, between worlds. Sebastian turned to say goodnight, and Marco was already looking at him with eyes that asked a question. Sebastian answered by closing the distance between them. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, both of them testing if this impossible thing was real. Then Marco's hand slid to the back of Sebastian's neck, and Sebastian pulled him closer, and the kiss deepened into something that felt like coming home to a place he'd never been. When the elevator reached the ground floor, they broke apart, breathing hard, foreheads pressed together. Marco whispered, "What are we doing?" And Sebastian, who'd been trained his entire life to have answers, said the only true thing he knew, "I don't know. But I don't want to stop." What began as stolen kisses became stolen nights. Sebastian would finish his board meetings and text Marco. They'd meet at places Sebastian had never been, dive bars in Brooklyn, late-night diners in Queens, the High Line at sunset when the tourists had gone. Marco showed Sebastian a city he'd lived in his whole life but never truly seen. A city of people and stories and moments that didn't make the business section but made up the heartbeat of something real. Sebastian showed Marco a different kind of beauty, the MoMA after hours when his family's donation bought them privacy, the theater from box seats where they could hold hands in the dark, rooftop gardens most New Yorkers didn't know existed. But more than places, Sebastian showed Marco his true self. The man who cried watching sad movies. Who laughed at stupid jokes. Who was terrified and brave and so desperately in love he ached with it. For 3 months, they existed in a bubble. They told themselves they could keep it secret forever. That somehow, Sebastian could marry Victoria for appearances while loving Marco in the shadows. That they could have stolen moments and it would be enough. But love, real love, refuses to stay hidden. It wants sunlight and truth and witnesses. It wants to dance in public. It wants to hold hands on the street. It wants to exist. The breaking point came at the Ashford Foundation Gala. Sebastian in a custom tuxedo, Victoria on his arm like a beautiful accessory. His father announced their engagement to a ballroom full of Manhattan's elite. Cameras flashed. Champagne flowed. Everyone celebrated the merger that would make both families richer. Sebastian stood there, Victoria's hand in his, and felt like he was watching his own funeral. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Marco, saw the news. Congratulations. I understand. Those last 2 words shattered him. Because Marco did understand, understood that Sebastian was choosing the safe path, the expected path, the path that kept his family happy and his empire intact. Marco understood, and in understanding, was letting him go. Sebastian made it through 2 more toasts before he couldn't breathe. He walked off the stage, through the ballroom, past concerned calls from his mother, his father's angry glare, Victoria's confused face. He walked out of the Plaza Hotel into the New York night and kept walking. He found Marco on the roof of his apartment building in Washington Heights. Marco came up here to think, to escape, to look at the city lights and remember why he worked so hard. He wasn't surprised when Sebastian appeared, still in his tuxedo, breathing hard from climbing 6 flights because he couldn't wait for the elevator. They stared at each other across the rooftop. The city sprawled below them, millions of lives, millions of stories, and theirs felt both infinitely small and impossibly huge. Sebastian spoke first. I told them no. I told my father I wouldn't marry Victoria. I told him the truth about who I am, who I love. I told him about you. Marco's eyes filled with tears. What did he say? He said I'd lose everything. The company. The family. My inheritance. He said I'd be making the biggest mistake of my life. Sebastian crossed the rooftop, closing the distance between them. But the biggest mistake of my life would be letting you go. You asked me once what we were doing. I finally have an answer, I'm choosing to live my own life. And I'm choosing you. Marco shook his head, tears falling now. Sebastian, you can't throw away everything for me. Your family, your company. I'm not throwing anything away. I'm walking toward something worth having. Sebastian cupped Marco's face in his hands. You showed me what it means to be rich. It's not the penthouse or the bank accounts. It's waking up next to someone who loves you for who you are, not what you're worth. It's laughing until you can't breathe. It's being so completely yourself that you forget to be afraid. That's what you gave me. That's what I want. They kissed on that rooftop with the city as their witness. And this time, there was no elevator door to separate them, no secret to keep, no pretending this was anything less than exactly what it was, 2 people choosing love over everything else. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Richard Ashford didn't just cut Sebastian off, he went to war. Lawyers. Public statements. A media campaign painting Sebastian as unstable, claiming Marco was a gold digger despite him having refused every gift Sebastian tried to give. The business press had a field day. The society pages crucified them. Old friends became strangers overnight. But something else happened too. Letters arrived at Sebastian's new apartment, a modest place in Marco's neighborhood that felt more like home than the penthouse ever had. Letters from people who'd seen their story. A teenager in Iowa who came out to his family. A woman in Seattle who'd left her arranged marriage. A grandfather in Miami who'd lived his whole life in the closet and wept watching two young men be brave enough to choose differently. Sebastian learned that empire wasn't just what his father built from steel and stocks. Empire could be built from courage. From visibility. From refusing to hide. He started his own company, not in real estate but in affordable housing development. Marco's influence showing him that true wealth was created by lifting people up, not by building higher towers to look down from. The company struggled at first. But slowly, investors who cared about more than just profit margins found them. Marco finished his degree while working alongside Sebastian, both of them learning that building something meaningful was harder than inheriting something established, but infinitely more satisfying. 3 years after that rooftop confession, Sebastian and Marco stood in front of their friends, a mix of Marco's family from Washington Heights and the few of Sebastian's circle who'd chosen love over loyalty to his father. No ballroom. No 500-person guest list. Just a small ceremony in Central Park where they'd had their first real date, both of them in simple suits, hands shaking as they exchanged vows. Marco's mother cried happy tears. Sebastian's mother didn't attend, but she'd sent a card, just 2 words, "Be happy." It was a start. When they kissed as married men, the small crowd erupted in cheers. And Sebastian realized something profound. He'd spent 24 years building toward inheriting a billion-dollar empire, but he'd never felt as wealthy as he did in this moment, Marco's hand in his, surrounded by people who loved them not for what they had but for who they'd become. Years passed. Their company grew. Not into the behemoth Ashford Industries was, but into something sustainable, meaningful, that built communities instead of just buildings. They stayed in Washington Heights, though they could afford to move. Marco's grandmother visited from Bogota and declared their apartment too small, their cooking terrible, and their love the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. On the 5th anniversary of that first delivery, they went back to Sebastian's old penthouse. The building had changed owners. The doorman who'd once called Marco the delivery boy now called him Mr. Ashford Reyes, with respect earned, not bought. They stood at those floor-to-ceiling windows, the city glittering below like it had that first night. Sebastian wrapped his arms around Marco from behind, chin on his shoulder, and they looked out at Manhattan together. "Do you ever regret it?" Marco asked quietly. "Everything you gave up?" Sebastian turned Marco to face him. His face had changed, lines around his eyes from smiling, a scar on his chin from when they tried to renovate their kitchen themselves and failed gloriously. He looked nothing like the polished heir who'd graced Forbes. He looked happy. "I gave up a life I never wanted for a life I chose. That's not loss. That's liberation." He kissed Marco softly. "Besides, I gained everything that matters. You. Us. A life that's actually mine." The elevator dinged behind them, announcing it was time to leave. As they stepped inside, Marco grinned. "Remember when you were too nervous to kiss me in this elevator?" Sebastian pulled him close as the doors shut. "I'm not nervous anymore." Their kiss, years later, still held all the electricity of that first one. Still felt like coming home. Still tasted like the best decision either of them had ever made. The Manhattan heir who loved a delivery boy didn't destroy an empire. He built a better one. Not of steel and stock portfolios, but of authenticity, courage, and love that refused to apologize for existing. The story the elite tried to bury became the story that gave others permission to live truthfully. That showed the world that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose love over legacy, truth over tradition, happiness over inheritance. Because in the end, Sebastian didn't lose everything. He lost the cage and found wings. He lost the performance and found peace. He lost the billion-dollar empire built on old money and older lies, and gained something infinitely more valuable, a life worth living, with a man worth loving, in a city that had always held space for dreamers brave enough to claim it. Some love stories are worth losing everything for. But here's the truth they don't tell you in boardrooms and at galas where champagne costs more than monthly rent: when you choose real love over everything else, you don't lose. You finally start winning.
Hit the subscribe button for more enchanting tales every week. Don't forget to keep the magic alive.